If you love gardening but aren't sure how to design your space, you're in good company. Garden design is honestly a very intimidating task for most people. But with a few tricks up our sleeves, we can design spaces that rival the gardening magazines. A few months back, I did a video where I featured 3 simple garden design principles that we can all apply, and I asked you guys to submit your gardens for a chance at a free design. There were lots of submissions, and you guys have some really interesting and challenging spaces. It was hard to pick just one, so I picked 2. And we're going to walk through the design process for both of those while talking about common garden design mistakes and how we can avoid them along the way. Our first garden was submitted by Lori, and she's in Maryland like me. Lori has a large open space with what looks like some really lovely mature gardens. And our second garden is this absolutely adorable house submitted by August in Minnesota. Here we're working with a more limited space, and this garden feels like a study in microclimates, which can be surprisingly common and really challenging. These 2 gardens are really different from each other, but they're perfect for highlighting some common garden design mistakes, so that's perfect for talking through how to avoid them. So garden number 1 really spoke to me because this garden features a memorial tree for the owner's mom. Look at that rainbow over the tree. Lori wrote in to say, "This is a memorial tree I planted for my mother. I need to redo this bed and make it the centerpiece of my backyard. I'm currently redoing many of my beds, but this one I just can't seem to figure out." One thing Lori mentioned as a concern is that the left side of the memorial tree is mostly shaded and the right side is in sun. So I'm guessing south is off to the right here, and the sun rises and sets roughly along this line. So Lori's wanting some help to choose plants for this mixed lighting space, which is tricky. Okay, so the big goal here is to develop a new garden around this memorial tree that accentuates the tree and really makes it the main feature. Before we start working on a design for this garden, this is a good time to mention one of the most common garden design mistakes, and that's making our garden beds too small. Especially here in the States, we're used to seeing undersized gardens as kind of the norm. For most new homes, for example, builders will install that narrow front strip of garden that we're all used to seeing, and this is maybe what many of us have come to think of as the norm for garden size. But actually, the average American garden bed is drastically undersized. For Lori's design in particular, we might be especially inclined to make a small garden space just around the base of the memorial tree, out of fear of having the garden overpower the tree. But we really don't have to choose between a large garden space and making this tree the focal point. We can do both. To show you what I mean, I'm going to walk you through my design inspiration for this space. So when I read Lori's message, this memorial tree for her mother really hit me on the heartstrings, and it actually took me back to a memory I have of my grandmother's funeral. My family and I were standing at the gravesite. We were saying a few words about my grandmother, and I'm there with my mom and my brother, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, and it just kind of hit me that most of us standing there were only there because of my grandmother. I had kind of an image of her as this like portal of life, and the only reason that most of us were there was because she gave us life. So Lori, when I saw your memorial tree for your mom, it kind of took me back to this moment, and I had this image of almost a river of life flowing from your mom's tree. And that was sort of the inspiration for this garden. Now, Lori's garden is quite large and open in the middle here, and open spaces like this can be surprisingly some of the hardest to design. When you have this much space to play with, it can actually be harder to figure out what to do. So I decided to lean into this idea of a river of life, and I sketched out a garden bed that kind of encircles the base of the tree, but then also expands so that it kind of flows out from the tree like a river. So Lori, the scale of this garden might be quite a bit bigger than you might have originally pictured, but I think a large garden like this can really carry us towards the main feature, your memorial tree, as like a destination. Now, I'm not totally positive of the location of Lori's house in the space here, so I did my best to pick what might be a good direction for the river to be flowing, but this could easily be rotated if the placement needs a little bit of adjustment. So because this is a pretty substantial garden bed, I've added a little path cutting through, both so that you can move through the yard easily. That's really important just for practicality, but also so that you have a space to kind of immerse yourself in the garden. For a large bed like this, it might feel really intimidating to install it all at once, so you can definitely start with a smaller portion and then expand it over time. But having an idea in place for the end goal is really helpful so that you know what you're working towards. So now we're looking at filling this space. It's a good time to talk about the second really common mistake in most gardens, and that's underfilling the garden beds. It's so common to see gardens that are like 60 to 70% mulch and only like 30 to 40% plants, but in a full sun space like this, those big mulch gaps are going to be absolutely overtaken with weeds. And this is a lot of space to maintain, so we definitely want to try to keep the maintenance as low as possible. And having your plants packed in tightly and spaced so that they have just enough room and maybe overlap with each other just a little bit at their mature size will shade out the ground, and that's going to be a huge help to suppressing weeds. Since the inspiration for this garden is a river of life flowing out from this memorial tree, I think it would be lovely to fill this space with lots of flowering perennials that would be colorful and vibrant and full of life themselves, but that will also attract a lot of life to them, like bees, butterflies, birds. So how do we choose our plants? Well, our third really common garden design mistake is just heading to the garden center and buying plants based on what we see there. When we do this, we're usually kind of dazzled by what's in bloom at that time when we go, and then we end up selecting plants that all bloom at the same time. So our garden would have like an amazing peak season, but then for the rest of the year, it might look pretty drab. What we want to do instead is research plants that would perform well with our site conditions, and then select plants with bloom times that span the full growing season for your area. For Lori and I here in Maryland, that would mean we want blooms really starting from kind of April straight through until October and even November, depending on the year. We really can't easily achieve that unless we are researching and planning our plant choices before we go to the garden nursery. What I would recommend with a big bed like this one is to start by folding in some sort of sweeps of structural grasses. That would hold an organized form in the space throughout all of the seasons. And I would suggest working with native grasses because those are nutritionally balanced for your local birds. So you'll hopefully get to see them using these grasses as a living bird feeder, which is really fun. As part of the flow and balance of this space, I think it would be nice to have some taller plants towards the center of the garden. And then also as we move back towards sort of this back side of the garden. Maybe something like big blue stem or switchgrass on the far side of the garden here. And then if we want to have the height of the garden gradually come a little bit lower towards the front side, we could work with grasses like prairie dropseed, little blue stem. Pink muley grass is another option that puts on a really fluffy pink show in the fall when it goes to seed. Another nice feature of including large swaths of native grasses in a garden like this is that they're usually really easy to start from seed. So you could hopefully get some nice big sweeps of really high impact architectural grasses into your garden for very little money. And grasses have so much motion to them just on their own, sort of when the wind blows. So that would work really well with this idea of the garden as a river of life. Another structural plant that we could include in a few spots around the garden is called New Jersey tea. This is a really lovely compact shrub that should attract you a ton of pollinators. With any structural plants, it's really helpful to repeat them in a few places, and that kind of gives a sense of unity and would help to tie a big garden space like this together. So we could repeat that New Jersey tea in a few places. And usually if you're doing repetition, we want to use odd numbers. That's a good rule of thumb. So maybe 3 or 5 of these shrubs placed around the gardens. A second way to keep a big space like this feeling cohesive is to work with a fairly limited color palette. For Lori's garden, I'm sticking with mainly pinks and purples and whites. And then you can pull in an accent color too. I think having an accent like orange would give kind of a burst of energy and interest, but still not feel like it's too busy. And a third really handy trick for making your garden feel organized and intentional is grouping plants that have roughly the same height. So for the edges of the garden, I've picked slightly shorter plants, and then I'm gradually moving as we go to the center of the bed towards a little bit taller. So going from something like 1 to 2 feet on the edges to more like 3 to 4 feet in the center. I've got phlox in there, or you could even swap that for something like wild sweet William, or you could use both really since you've got so much space here. For some deeper purples, I added some blue baptisia. You could fold in some salvias if you wanted. Rose milkweed and purple milkweed are both really stunning. Those would fall into the same sort of pinks and purples. For the orange accent, I've added butterfly milkweed, and again, you can see that I've put that in a few different places, again, holding odds for repetition. And then back into the pinky purples, I've added some liatris as well. Liatris is an awesome plant and has really interesting blooms that will add some different texture to the garden, and it's definitely a butterfly magnet. For low plants along the borders, I've added in some sweeps of Pearly Everlasting, which stays nice and low, and that's going to attract butterflies for you as well. So you should see lots of life on all these plants. I mentioned before that we might transition the height towards the center of the garden and towards the back of the garden. And that also kind of makes this back portion of the garden feel like a really submersive experience. This is where we have that path moving through. So as we're walking through this space, the garden's going to kind of envelop us in it. I would love to see a small grouping of Queen of the Prairie back in this taller portion of the garden. It is such a stunning plant, and the blooms should spike up around the 4 to 6 foot tall mark. So that would work really well with the taller grasses that we've included back here. This winter, I actually ordered some Queen of the Prairie for myself, so I am super excited for that to get here and to see it bloom in person. So that mostly fills the full sun portion of the garden, and now we can move towards the trickier part sun, part shade space. I think on our sun-facing side of this garden, we just could repeat some of the same grasses that we had before for structure. And then let's just go ahead and repeat some of the same perennials as well. That will help to link these two different garden beds together. So I've got the Baptisia repeated here, the Liatris, another New Jersey tea, butterfly milkweed, any plants that you kind of prefer from the larger bed, tying those into this bed will help to make these two gardens feel like they are working together. Having an open path that goes up to the tree is a great way to give an invitation to come up and actually visit with your memorial tree. A seating area underneath would be really lovely, but Lori mentioned that they have plenty of seating, so you could do something simple like just a bench under here, or even a large boulder that you could lean against. Just anything that kind of invites you to pause there, rest, enjoy the shade of the tree, and kind of come and visit with this memorial garden. So wrapping around into the shade side, Lori mentioned that she already has some red flowering azaleas in this space. So I actually think we should run with that and even add in a few more flowering shrubs. Pinkster azalea is a native to Maryland that blooms in a really beautiful soft pink. Flame azalea is another one that's native to Maryland that could be really interesting if you want to tie in some more of that orange accent color in this shady space. I think that one can tolerate a little bit more sun, so you might be able to kind of bring that around a little bit closer to the sun-facing side. So one of Lori's concerns is having the garden be something that kind of distracts you from the memorial tree. But I think having a sweep of structural shrubs that kind of round out the back edge of this garden under the tree kind of embraces you as you come into the space, slows you down, and I think it really kind of cements the tree as the destination of the garden. It feels like we've kind of arrived when we get into this space here. There's lots of different plants that we could use to sort of fill in this space more. You could mix in some sedges. Those would mimic the structure of the grasses. Tiarella is a really great flowering perennial that would do well in shade. Tall bellflower would pull in some of those sort of purples. Ghostbeard is one I really love. There's tons of perennials that would be really happy to be tucked into the shade here. And I think I would leave the center of this garden right under the tree just as mulch so that you can come right up to your tree. So in the sun garden, I said we should not be leaving any bare mulch showing. But in a sunny space, that's where you're going to get really heavy germination rates for your weeds. Because this area is in the shade, if we were to leave a large mulched area like this, I don't think you'll see a whole lot of weed maintenance here. Also because the tree roots are in this space, they'll be taking up a lot of resources. So hopefully you could have a nice open space that you can come right up to the tree and it wouldn't lead to much maintenance for you. To really make sure that the tree feels like the destination here, I would avoid having this path under the tree cut through this sort of shade sun garden bed. If you have the path cutting all the way through, it kind of is telling you that you use the space to move in and out. Instead, I would keep it as only a path in, and then we have that sort of open mulch area that allows you to kind of move and come back out. Or you could even make like a U-shaped path that kind of encircles the tree. But I would try to avoid having a path cutting through that makes it feel like it's a pass-through area. We want to feel like the path is guiding us to this tree and that we should stop there. Thanks so much to Lori for submitting your garden. It's such a lovely space. Hopefully this gives you some ideas and doesn't feel too intimidating. Although you've got some really big, lovely gardens in place already, so it seems like you're not too afraid of a big garden. Our second garden is this adorable house submitted by August up north in Minnesota. This garden's really different because here we're working with a series of smaller yard spaces that are kind of spread out around the home. August wrote to say, "We are hoping to do quite a bit of food production, probably in raised beds on the side of the house. We have planted a Stella cherry tree, and we're thinking about adding additional fruit trees such as serviceberry, elderberry, or pawpaw. We're hoping to add fences so our dogs can roam a little more freely." I think you're spot on with all of these ideas. And one of the main challenges in this space is that it's like microclimates on steroids. And this is a challenge that many of us face since just the structures of our home alone will often create a range of microclimates. So this brings me to our fourth common garden design mistake, which is not properly assessing our site conditions and then choosing plants that can't thrive in our particular space. This is a mistake that we could easily make in August's garden. So let's talk about how to assess and handle these different microclimates in our yard. So a microclimate is just a small area of your garden that has conditions that are kind of unique or different when you compare them with other regions of your garden. The front of August's house here is north facing, and you can actually see the sun right behind the house there in this photo. So this front space is going to get limited direct sunlight, especially as you move closer to the house. If I have my cardinal directions right, then the side yard here on the left is going to get afternoon sun and maybe even some evening sun, depending on how close the neighbor's house is. And then the back garden is south facing, but also has this garage blocking the sun. So we'll end up with another shade garden, I think, up against the garage wall. And then I'm hoping that there might be a bit more sun on the deck area. Those different sun exposures are also going to cause some temperature variations in these different spaces. If you had any recessed areas, like a dip in your yard, something like a rain garden, those are areas that might stay a little bit cooler, and then elevated portions of your yard might get a little bit warmer. Elevation differences can also lead to water collecting in some regions of your landscape and other regions being a lot drier. All the walls of the home are going to impact the way that the rainfall is kind of either stopped or funneled in these different microclimates. So like if your prevailing winds were mostly northwest, then we might expect that the house could actually be blocking rainfall to the back portion of the garden. And then finally, wind. The houses in a neighborhood will often kind of channel wind, and you might get wind that whips through some spaces while other spaces are more protected by the walls and actually get sheltered by the homes. So all of these considerations are really important to think through when we're selecting plants. As much as possible, we want to understand the different microclimates in our space so that we can lean into them and choose plants that will really love those specific conditions. So August's big goal is food production, and many food crops really require full sun. But these gardens seem to be mostly shady or part sun, with maybe just a few limited regions that get close to full sun, I'm hoping. So it's extra important here to try to identify food plants that will do well both in the sunnier regions and also to try to squeeze some shade-tolerant food crops into the shadier regions of the yard. But before we tackle that, let me throw out our last common garden design mistake, number 5, which is being too practical with our garden spaces. If you have a goal of lots of food production, then it can feel really frivolous and like a mistake to include flowers in your garden. You might be inclined to reserve all of your available space for food production. But if we want abundant food production, then we also really need plants that will fully support all the pollinators that we're going to want to invite in to live in the garden and do all of our food production for us. So we really both want to be thinking about feeding ourselves, and we want to make sure that we're feeding our pollinators through all of the seasons. So again, in my region, this would be April through November. In Minnesota, you'll have a little bit more limited growing season. So you might end up with some flowers, just flowering plants that are mixed in with your food crops. And I actually think that you might find that this will attract you out into the garden. If you only have food crops, which can be very high maintenance, then the garden can really start to feel like just work, and it can kind of put you off to going outside and getting your hands dirty. But having flowers to enjoy, maybe even some flowers that you could cut to bring into the house, can kind of lure you out into your garden. And then I think you'll find you're more likely to take care of all those food crops that you are hoping to enjoy. So I used air quotes when I said don't be too practical, but honestly, including some flowers in with your food production is really practical in my opinion, because it's going to help you get drawn out there to work in your garden, and it's going to help your pollinators to be able to come and support your food production. So let's tackle blending our complicated microclimates here with designing a plant palette that will thrive, feed us, and feed the pollinators. So this northeastern portion of the garden at the front of the house should get morning sun and then some afternoon shade. So let's tuck a tree in here that would do well with part shade. I'm going to put a redbud, which should be pretty fast growing but still stay fairly compact. And it's an awesome early bloomer that will help support pollinators right as they're emerging in the spring, which is a very challenging time for them. Those are some hungry bugs, so we really want to have something blooming for them as early as possible. We should get a little bit more sun here further from the house on this northwest side, so let's plant a fruiting tree here. August suggested something like a serviceberry tree, and I think that's a great idea. That produces fruit kind of like blueberries, and there's different species that are native to Minnesota, and they'll have some different mature sizes, so you can kind of think about the range there. A downy serviceberry might be a good option. That's like a multi-stem tree that will get to about 15 to 25 feet tall. I read that Saskatoon serviceberry has some of the best fruit, and that's one that would stay under 9 feet tall. So that will be sort of more in line with a large shrub. You might be able to fit those in other places in the yard as well. Let's fold in some shrubs up front here too. American elderberry should be fairly shade tolerant, and that would produce some fruit for you. So we could put one of those out here with the red bud. You can try to tweak the position of that to take advantage of as much sun as possible. So getting a little bit further from the house will help you out there. Another option to think about is American highbush cranberry. that would tolerate part shade and makes a fruit that's pretty similar to the traditional cranberries that we would have around the holidays. So that one's kind of fun. And then August mentioned that they are allowed to plant this strip out front. So we've got the serviceberry there, but we could also think about adding something like a chokeberry. We could include some ground covers, something like bearberry or cranberry. Both of those are edible, although I think you have to get a little bit more creative to use the bearberry. And I think they have slightly different preferences, so it would definitely help to assess these specific site conditions along this strip and try to figure out which of those two plants will be better suited to the sun, soil, water conditions in this particular space. For some all-season interest, I included some inkberry hollies here. Those will give a nice structure in the winter, and the pollinators will really love those in the spring. So as you go closer to the house and it gets shadier, you could keep filling in that space with lots of shade lovers, things like ferns. Again, tiarella is a beautiful one that gives blooms that the bees would enjoy. But this gives us a nice foundation of trees and shrubs and a decent amount of food production in terms of berry-producing plants, even just in the front yard so far. For the side garden, August suggested having some raised beds in this space, and I think that's a really great idea. Ideally, if you could take up this portion of the concrete pad that's here and lay that area with mulch, I think that would help you to get as much gardening space in this area as possible. I think maybe you could squeeze 3 square beds in here. And August, you mentioned planting a cherry tree in this space. I think we might want to move that, but I'm going to come back to that topic. Let's also fence this space off so that your dogs can run around in here. A white picket fence that kind of calls out all that beautiful white detailing from your house would look really nice. And I added an arbor in the front as well as kind of a welcome to the garden. I think you could put a gate that opens into the garden through the arbor there, and that would be super charming. So this side yard is going to be shaded for the first half of the day, especially up close to the home. So when we're thinking about this microclimate, we're going to have sort of a graduated space of deep sun through probably close to noon, and then the outer edge of the garden here would get sun a little bit earlier. So this is tricky because a lot of our food crops really want full sun, so 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. So I think we want to have the raised beds as far away from the house as possible to try to get them to catch that early sun exposure as much as we can. There's an app I would recommend that you download that actually lets you measure your sun exposure and then map exactly how many hours you expect, at least in the growing season for this region, to get. And so I would recommend using that app in each of these different microclimates to try to get a sense of which of these fall into full shade, part sun, and full sun. And that'll really help you kind of figure out what plants you can work with in these different regions. I think we're all optimists when it comes to the amount of sun we get. So that app, I think, could give you an honest estimate of the amount of sun that these different regions will be getting, and then you can work to that when you're selecting your plants. I'm going to guess that any real sun-loving veggies are probably going to need to be on the western edge of these raised beds. And you could also try to go vertical with things so that they can get up and out of the shadow of the house earlier in the day and get as much sun as possible. So things like beans or peas, indeterminate tomatoes. Last year I trained those up vertically on cattle fencing, and that worked really nicely. And then maybe on the side of the raised beds that's closer to the house, there we could start thinking about veggies that would tolerate a little bit more shade. So your salad greens, I think celery and beets can tolerate a little bit more shade. Broccoli and some other root vegetables might be able to tolerate a little bit more shade. I think veggie gardening is something that has to be kind of embraced as a learning experience, and especially in a space with trickier lighting like this, you might just have to try things and see how they do and adjust from year to year. To help, you can search online for veggies that would grow in shade and part shade to help give you some ideas for things you might be able to grow on the side of the beds that's closer to the house. And then just experiment, and don't get discouraged if things don't go well at first. You're going to need some time and experimentation just to learn this space. Okay, so I mentioned that August recently planted a Stella cherry tree in this side yard. I think the mature size of that tree is going to be about 15 to 20 feet tall and wide. But if that's still young, which I think it is, I would consider moving that closer to the front corner of the yard here, or even out to the front of the house where I had that serviceberry. Because as your tree grows, it's going to start casting more and more shade in this space, and that's going to make your lighting challenges even trickier here. And this is really I think your best bet at a large space to grow your food crops. So if you think you can move it, I would consider either shifting it as close to the front corner of the garden, or better yet, around to the front of the house to try to keep that side yard as sunny as you can. Okay, now we've got this lovely driveway that's wrapping around here and leading us to the back. And I think we could work in some more fruiting shrubs here. You could put something like a red currant up against this corner of the house. And I think this corner should catch a little bit more sun earlier in the morning. So I think this is an important little nook to take advantage of for food production. Again, going vertical is going to be a really important way that we can try to catch more sun. So I wanted to take advantage of this space for one more tree as well. So I added a pawpaw in here. I also added another elderberry near the garage, but you could think about things like raspberries or blackberries. You could think about blueberries as well, but in general, you'll need more than one plant in order to get fruit. So as long as that is something that you would really enjoy eating, then taking up the space with multiple shrubs of the same species would be good. I'm wondering if we might also be able to squeeze in something like a rhubarb next to the elderberry. My grandmother made the best strawberry rhubarb jam. A nice feature of this space is that the pawpaw and elderberry and rhubarb should also give your back patio some privacy while still producing more food for you. So that's a nice twofer. Okay, so the patio space here is riddled with different lighting conditions. I would definitely use that Sunlight app in this area to map out how many hours of sunlight each of these different spaces get. I think you maybe have some daylilies in the middle here, but we might want to turn that into grass for the dogs. And I'm wondering if you could get some full sun loving perennials right along the back of the porch here. That would be really nice for you to look at while you're sitting in the backyard. And then your pollinators are going to love that too. And you could potentially squeeze in one or two food crops amongst your flowers here as well. Along the fence to the neighbors, I think it would be nice to plant some taller grasses there to give you some privacy. That's one where you're definitely going to want to check your sun exposure, because a lot of those tall grasses will not do well without close to full sun. But if they will work there, then I think you will see birds sitting along your fence and then eating the seeds in the fall and winter, and that's really fun to watch. And then along the garage side, where I think we're back basically into full shade again, sedges, ferns, things like that would be really lovely. Tall bellflower would give you some more blooms for the pollinators and some color. I added a shade-tolerant milkweed along this wall as well. It's called poke milkweed. So if you have any monarchs visit, they could be nesting right there in your backyard, which would be really fun. I ordered some pokeweed myself for one of our shade gardens. If you do decide to add milkweed, that's one that you'll want to plant in a grouping. That will really help your monarchs to kind of sniff out that they're there. It can be hard for them to find just a single plant, but if you have a group, that will help them to find them. So this is a really lovely patio space, and hopefully if you can kind of figure out those lighting conditions and find plants that would do well in those different sites, you could get some really pretty gardens that flank all around and give you some nice privacy. Okay, so those are our 2 gardens designed with some of the most common gardening design mistakes in mind. For Lori and August, I'll put together some plant lists and send everything over to you so that you can see it in more detail. And I mentioned before that I had a lot of submissions. I would love to do this more regularly, and I am hoping to do a design for everyone who submitted. That's going to take me a little bit of time, but many of the design principles that I was using for these designs are actually ones that I featured in another recent video. So in the meantime, if you want to learn a few simple tricks for designing yourself a stunning garden space, watch this video next.